on the advisory board of the EAC Cultural Foundation, a nonprofit that organizes language and cultural revitalization gatherings. And in the future, Jen is also really interested in language preservation and developing that line of research and work. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Jen Rose Smith.
You're good. Hi, everyone. Hishu. Good afternoon, and wa'afta for being here. I'll just sit and talk slowly until we're ready. Yeah, I'm okay. I was just gonna wait until the tech was ready. But I just want to thank Ruan and thank Sarah. Thank you both for reading my book so carefully and being in conversation with me. I appreciate it. Thank you, Ruan, for inviting me. And also thank you to the Center for the Study of Demography and Ecology for supporting my book. Jen Rose Smith, Thank you. Sichushia Rosie Sichuma Lina so I just introduced you to my matrilineal line. So that's my mom, Anne, in the bottom right-hand corner, my grandma to the left, and my great-grandma Lena to up above. And these are just a few photos of my homeland. So in what's for now known as Cordova, Alaska. And as Rowan said, I work here in Coast Salish territories where we all live. And I'm a scholar of Native American and Indigenous studies, Native American literature, environmental humanities, and cultural human geography. Before I talk a little bit about my book, I just want to say a kind of bigger context about what I do and what I think about. Just to familiarize you all with me and my work. So across my community work and my academic research, I'm committed to critical questions about coloniality, racialization, and Indigenous knowledge production, especially creative knowledge production, particularly in Alaska and in the circumpolar Arctic more broadly. And so Rowan mentioned some of the work that I do back home, so I'll just say a little bit more now and show some images. Some of this work takes form in serving on an advisory committee for the EAC Cultural Foundation, which is a nonprofit led by EAC people. Many of the things we do, one of them is organizing annual language revitalization events every summer held in our homelands. So as we're thinking about revitalizing our language, we're also reclaiming skills of harvesting plants and smoking salmon. You can see in some of the photos. This one on the bottom is pickled fish. Has anyone had like pickled salmon before? Oh, yay, one person, okay. Oh, Henry, of course, too, okay. So just a little bit about that work back home. And then some of the other work that I do is some public scholarship. So I do have this commitment to more public-facing work. And if you did have a chance to look at the book at all, that's really more represented in sort of the prologue and the epilogue. So living much of my life in rural Alaska and returning home seasonally to continue my community work has really always shaped my intellectual interests. So my community back home is not like the central research population of the work that I do. And that's for intentional purposes. So if anyone has questions about that, I'm happy to talk more. But my ongoing commitments politically and ethically there shape my scholarly work, as well as the more public-facing scholarship that I do, which includes poetry, prose, and with my favorite genres to write in, which is epic. And yeah, as Rowan mentioned, not only do I want to keep focusing on language revitalization work, but also doing more kind of creative nonfiction in the future, which comes with the privilege of tenure, right? So looking forward. So I'll only just say a little bit about my book. I don't want to drone on and on about it. But for those of you who are not familiar, my book, Ice Geographies, came out last May. So this is the anniversary of the year of my book. So yay. So in my book, I center ice, so snow ice, glacier ice, to critically study racialization, land dispossession, and Indigenous knowledge production about ice geographies. So most importantly, I ask, how is ice a racialized geography and imaginary? But more importantly, how does it also exceed those frameworks? So ice animates the look and feel of climate change. Mainstream media depicts melting glaciers and ice sheet collapse to mass audiences. Today, ice is melting faster than ever before, causing social upheaval among northern coastal communities. And melting ice will continue on to disrupt a more temperate world as sea levels rise. Conditions of ice are now a key interest for economic, academic, and activist stakeholders as the unsettling potential of ice shapes the way that humans understand and respond to the present and plan for the future. Yet, while such contemporary interests in ice have erupted in concert with rapid climate change, I argue that ice has always been at the center of making sense of the world, and not always through the lens of inevitable universalized destruction. Ice as a depeopled melting catastrophe, as a threat that will unsettle the settled and the settlers, is a modern iteration of longstanding ice obsessions and normative orderings. So as I show in my book, it has taken a considerable number of colonial enactments for the Arctic to be imagined as empty, especially as ontologically, cosmologically, and juridically, ice in part shapes and figures the worlds for many indigenous peoples who call the Arctic home and homeland. So my book centers ice to study race and indigeneity, especially to understand ice as a more than human relation, as a site and source of analysis that is integrally bound up with colonial and racial formations. So over the course of 5 chapters, I use a mixed method approach of archival analysis and literary criticism that analyzes archival materials, poetry, fiction, embodied knowledges, film, and sculpture. So for example, I analyzed poetry by Inupiaq poet Joan Navayak Kane, short story by Inupiaq author Rainey Nasiprak Hobson, as well as reading together creative knowledge production across Arctic Indigenous writers of the Pacific, and writers of the Black diaspora to think together critical analytics of ice, land, and water. So just a little bit more on my methods. The chapters are organized thematically in this order: studying ice as analytic, ice as science data, ice as imaginary, ice as terrain, and ice among the stars. So taken together, the chapters make an interdisciplinary argument for the necessity of looking toward ice and materiality more generally to better understand enactments of colonialism and racialization, and to bring attention to critical indigenous theorizations about the world and ice geographies. So drawing from, again, archival research and cultural analysis of indigenous literature and theory and popular science discourse, I argue that ice has been wielded as a tool of dispossession and racialization as it has shaped and maintained narratives and enactments of white supremacy. And I'm also concerned with how ice, again, exceeds those formations, so not sort of condemned to violence alone. I offer and place literature and theory by Indigenous intellectuals from what's for now known as the United States and Canada at the core of my inquiries. So I ask fiction, poetry, prose, and theory to operate simultaneously as evidence, method, and practice to decipher and elucidate the politics, power, and place in and of many inhabited social and icy material worlds. I'm interested in and drawn to Indigenous knowledge production as both form and function. This interest shapes the content of the book by what I examine and ask for assistance, as well as the way that I write and move across voice in the chapters. So I'm invested not only in literary criticism as a method, but also in the craft of prose and poetry to create voice in scholarship. So I think that really crafting poetry, crafting prose is also about theorizing. So a little bit more about ice before I turn it over. Ice may take several shapes at once. 1, a weapon toward violent ends. 2, a foundation and collaborator for Indigenous knowledge production. 3, a matter that escapes and exceeds the intellectual binds of and workings of human thought. And this is to say that ice will act and enact as it sees fit. It is not simply responding to human activity or being analyzed through technologies that explain climate causality, and as well as the affective dimensions of human desires, including my own, although ice is also those things. So this is not to equate indigenous understandings and obligations of ice relationships with violent colonial incursions into or onto ice geographies. I aim to leave conceptual room for the experiences that ice may have that are untranslatable through human faculties. Not all human understandings are the same. The ongoing denigration and active erasure of indigenous sciences and law are not lost on me. And I also believe that there are limits to what a human being can experience, understand, and express. So we can make educated, careful, researched, studied guesses that are in place and formulated in ways that don't skip over ongoing indigenous relationalities. So I'm interested in the tools that help us guess carefully, that are not about access to knowing everything about everyone in all the imaginable ways, but that there is possibility in curiosity through consent and in slow study. That slow study must begin with the understanding that one is always working and thinking from indigenous lands, where indigenous peoples hold and practice intellectual frameworks that make sense of, care for, and govern those lands and relationships. So in the book, I offer a method that I refer to, as I mentioned, as careful guessing or careful guesswork. Building from critical indigenous studies, guesswork honors emptiness, which respects the refusals, the breaks, the pauses, the doors that are shut, and not inspecting the windows thereafter. Careful guesswork also urges a form of study that is not extractive, that is desire-based, that does not seek to build new theories that displace indigenous theorizing already present. Careful guessing is critically attentive to the ongoing dimensions and histories of power relations that shape the responses to the question at hand and the forms of questioning that seem possible and impossible. So who and what shapes my questions that seem naturalized to me? Careful guesswork upholds that I can guess to the best of my knowledge, with accountability to place and peoples, and with an ethic of anti-coloniality and decoloniality when possible. Careful guesswork insists that objectivity is an impossibility, that researchers are narrators who craft compromised stories. We are guessing always, and our guesses must work to be consensual among all forms of our interlocutors, relations, and the careful guessing that has emerged before us. So in my own guesswork, I'm studying, research, and guessing about indigenous ice geographies, the spatial materiality of ice, and the experiences that ice might be having. I cannot know with the normative performance of certainty that is expected of a researcher, but I can read, listen, and participate thoroughly, widely, experientially, and make careful guesses. The work of careful guessing in relation to non-human kin, entities, and collaborators is not to anthropomorphize, but guesswork upholds that ice geographies cannot and will not be enclosed by the stretches of human intellectualizing or imagination. As Saidiya Hartman writes about her concept of critical fabulation, there's a political, ethical, moral container we make as our own research protocols, and it is our responsibility to write and within and against the intellectual infrastructures that invent the limits of what and who counts and matters. So to just close, in analyzing ice as it has shaped racial and colonial formations, the book demonstrates that the study of power necessitates the study of matter. I offer that matter matters materially, imaginatively, and spatially. Moreover, ice and its various phases and movements, its generative emptiness, and its violent racial and gendered histories can never be subsumed by coloniality entirely. Ice has its own experiences about which we can only guess, and it is our responsibility to make those methods of guessing as careful and consensual as possible. Thank you.
Understand. Cluster happening of. So sorry we distracted from you. Maddie will work her magic. Yeah, have a donut. If you take a minute to grab a donut. Well, I'll just, before I get started, I'll start, and then it was a real pleasure. I also was reading until not midnight, but 11:30. But I did very much enjoy reading the book and ICE Geographies and learning more about Jen and Jen's work. And it's very timely for a number of reasons to read this book, which I'll explain in a second. But one of the most timely reasons is I just came out of our graduate professional research ethics class. Some of those who were in that class can raise their hands, and I know you're going to have comments. But we had a fantastic conversation. It was a great preliminary prep for this this discussion, especially around epistemology. How do we know what we know? What is our role as scientists? Scientists with the quotes around scientists, and data sovereignty. Are we good? Okay. So that was wonderful. I thought I would just offer a few reflections. I don't have major critiques. I just thought I would offer you a few thoughts. But before I go into my slides, I wanted to mention that just a little bit about myself, that I started out my demography career working on gender and migration were my topics. And then I moved into the field of environment, population and environment. And now more recently, thinking about this idea of critical demography. I don't exactly know where that will be going, but that's one of my projects for next year. But one of the things that I learned as I was studying as a demographer, trained in a very traditional demography department at the University of North Carolina, I was bumping up against these social categories of gender and understanding how, and I was doing field work in Thailand and learning, speaking Thai and understanding the linguistic nature of what gender is in Thailand, and also the ways in which gender changes over the life course. Nothing new, but as a demographer, as we're taught to like put things in boxes and in categories, it did raise a lot of questions. The other set of questions that came to me in that work was family, households. How do we understand these units that we tend to like put also into boxes? This house, this household head, these sets of relationships, when in fact, families and family networks and kinship networks are far more diffuse and reciprocal and change over time. And so how do we put meaningfulness to the ways we categorize and capture family was also something that came about. And then finally, the most obvious is the hardest thing to measure in demography, migration. What is it? Who does it? How far do people go? How long is a meaningful move? All of those questions, led me to be thinking critically about demography and our attempt to, put rigor around what we're doing. Then, as I was working on population environment issues, I was troubled by the ways in which both environmentalists think about populations, and then how population and environment scholars were kind of rigid in their approach. And with regards to how environmentalists think about population, they think about the bad of more people. And one of my efforts was correcting that notion to think about what do indigenous people do with regards to people in less developed countries, how they're managing their resources. Maybe they're not that bad. And maybe there's another way to think about the impacts of consumption in one part of the world having repercussion effects down the road on other parts of the world, which led to a book on edited book on food the geography of food. And then the second area was I started working in the area of coastal fisheries and the effect of migrants into coastal areas, and had been trying to translate some of the research around land-based relationships between people and the environment, and realizing how that idea of, this is how it's going to translate to ice. So how the notion of water and fisheries and marine environments really challenges how we think about the relationship between people and place. When you have a species moving in and out of an area, and this really was what initially captivated me about Jen's book, is that she beautifully describes how ice kind of melts and retreats and grows and builds and shrinks, and it's a fascinating way to think about our relationship to the environment. So let me tell you, there are several books that resonate with me that I connected to with regards to Jen's book. The first is a book that I read during COVID and have reread and had my students read this year, called The Dawn of Everything. Key ideas here are an indigenous critique that was very important in the late 16th century, that informed the Enlightenment, the creation, the ideas of the Enlightenment, but incompletely. It wasn't fully translated in the full meaning of how we understand what indigeneity and society, how those communities were organized. And then their argument is we're sort of stuck right now in a particular way in which we think about social relationships and society, and that we ought to reorganize our thinking to imagine not so much the question of inequality or equality, but thinking about freedom and not conflate the two concepts, and think about them more broadly and more in a less sort of liberal progressive approach. The other is Foucault's work on security, territory, population. These were lectures that were written between 1977 and 1978, and in particular, they focus on, they are a set of lectures that focus on the importance of population and governmentality and the role of governments in managing, surveilling, controlling populations for their purposes. And, I think as demographers, we have to recognize that the roots of demography come out of this, this inclination of states, and Foucault is a very important contributor to, should be a really important contributor to your understanding of the field of demography, and questioning it from a critical standpoint. The second is a novel I read recently called The Island of Missing Trees by Elif Shafak, which is about Cyprus and war and resilience and trauma. I'll tell you why in a second, why I love this book. I almost thought I would teach my class around this book, because it has to do with humanitarianism, displacement, war, religious intermarriage, and the like. Recently I went to a town hall lecture by Kili Yulan about the Guardians of Life, which has a lot of connections to your work, Jen. And finally, at the PAA a couple weeks ago, I was one of the supporters of the Feminist Demography Collective at the PAA, which is a new initiative, a revival of some initiatives from 30, 40 years ago, but a new one trying to push our agenda in demography. So these are my thematic thoughts, and this is my last slide. So from ICE Geographies, what I took away, some really cool things, and one of the things I didn't put down here, but I also took away, but this idea of emptiness, the concept of emptiness, I think it's like when I was thinking about marine environments, it kind of blows up your mind when you could think about our relationship to place and space. I think it was really profound the way you wrote about emptiness. The predominant narratives about emptiness as Jen really clearly describes, is about these are places that are unproductive, they're backward, really they're not valuable, and they're available for conquering and exploration. Regardless of the fact that actually people live there, there is a productivity there. There are, there are beings that live there, and there's all sorts of ways to think about ice as a living thing. And then how ice sort of melts and blurs and changes invites a lot of questions about dynamism and fluidity. From the perspective of science, one of the ways in which I saw the contributions of Jen's work was around methodological nationalism, how we territorialize our research and our science, and certainly that's the case in the field of sociology, which is highly American-centric, or demography, which is one of the epitomes of methodological nationalism. And our need to fixate on putting people and place into fixed categories or demarcations. And finally, who's doing the science of knowing? So traditional TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. But I really like what Jen was just talking about at the end of her presentation. And I would have added it to careful guessing. So we were just talking about this in our at the end of our research ethics class today, about the drive to be precise and find the exact answer, as opposed to in much of our science, especially in public health and in demography, as opposed to imagining uncertainty and appreciating heterogeneity and all the ways in which there might be many other ways in which to understand what's happening in the world. So as I mentioned, from Graeber and Wengrow, Indigenous Critique and Freedom versus Progress and Equality, I think how we think about who's understanding what we know is super important, and we might allow ourselves to have more people at the table producing knowledge. I think what I wanted to say about the Shafak book is that this is a book that's about rooted relationships. One of the main characters in the book is a fig tree, and the fig tree narrates the entire book and watches the lives cross its path and gives comments about it. In Yulan's presentation, I just want to make note of a couple of things for those of you who care about the environment. 40% of the remaining natural land and 80% of species are associated with indigenous places. This is a really profound statistic. I take it quite seriously, and this is a reason why we need to bring indigenous people to the table and helping us understand and maintain that natural wildness and species. The other point here at Yulan's point is we have to start to see things from multiple vantage points, whether human, animal, plant, and that certainly was reflected in the Shafak book for me. But this duality is also something W.E.B. Du Bois, one of our earliest demographers, talks about, the importance of the multiplicity of perspectives and how people at the margins. So one of my students talked about designing at the margins, and thinking about people on the margins have a lot more insight on society and social and power relations than perhaps we do in the center of the world. So finally, Feminist Demography Collective is asking questions about the fluidity of categories, systems of relations that define demographic dynamics, particularly that these are non-linear, and encouraging avoiding dissection, separation, and isolation as approach to science, and thinking more in terms of integration. But most importantly, and finally, thinking about the ethics of visibility and opacity of people, places, and things. Do we have to explore every part of the world? Do we have to make visible every kind of person that we think should be made present? Who has the right to make those choices about what's explored and what's made visible? So thank you, Jen, for a great book. I really enjoyed it.
Hi, everybody. I also had the privilege of reading Jen's book, and as I was reading it, I had you all in mind. You know, the idea of, so demographers do lots of things that I don't know how to do. A lot of quantitative things that I have been learning over my time here at CSDE about. More than anything, I've been really impressed by the ways in which quantitative demography can lead you to asking certain kinds of questions that have theoretical implications that hadn't quite occurred to me. And that's been one of, actually Min's presentation was just like one of my favorites around that, including all the questions that were asked if y'all were here for that. And I think that coming into this role and you know, thank you to Sarah and to folks in CSDE for giving me this chance. I've just been confronted with this question about how do we select methods? How do we know what we know? How do we try to discover what we would like to know? And I think that in this breadth of qualitative and quantitative, Jen and maybe a couple others are among the very few opportunities that we've had to actually bring the humanities also into this conversation. And I think that can, I think sometimes folks are skeptical of that, you know, what does a quantitative, okay, I'll put it this way, what does a quantitative demographer have to learn from a poet? I think that folks might be a little skeptical when they're thinking about answers to that question. And I think that Jen's book does a really great job in trying to answer it. Can you imagine? At one point, I found myself, because Jen talks about poetry and other forms of artwork and prose as theory making, that becomes the ground at which we can compare and put ideas in conversation. So every time in these, you know, this last week when, of course, this is like when I started doing my homework for this, you know, and I'm like trying to talk about the book, I found myself not able to fully explain what Jen does such a great job explaining. And that's not just because of my personal own limitations. I think that's because there are limitations in our language and the ways in which we talk about knowledge production. And so I'm struck by how careful you must have been to try to bridge that gap. And so I guess what I'm telling you is I think you should read it so that you can understand how she does it, because it is really shocking to imagine, you know, how can a poet push against, let's say, a meteorologist that's working with a data set, right? Okay, now that I've given you that caveat, let me tell you some of the main lessons I got from this that I thought were really important. And also, this is just my reflection on what I think you would benefit from, not a reflection of how epic this book is. There's so much in here. The first thing I wanted to talk about, well, maybe I'll pick up on this careful guessing. And then you talked about normative performances of expertise. I thought about that in relation to something else that Jen had talked about slow study and what we can gain from slow study. I found myself thinking about how I learned what good science was and the ways in which trying to fill a gap or speaking to the literature has a kind of, I don't know if we can call it rapid, but an urgency, let's say, an urgent study to it that I think embeds in it boundaries around the kinds of questions that we ask and try to answer. And so I'll start with saying this idea of slow study. I can imagine that if someone could randomly give it lip service and we can say, okay, yes, we're all going too fast, whatever. But because you also talk a lot about capitalist extraction, I thought of fast or urgent study as another form of capitalist extraction that shapes how knowledge is produced. Again, I'm trying to bring the poet in conversation with the statistician. Then this notion, okay, so we have fast, urgent versus slow. Then this notion of emptiness, emptiness and this acceptance of emptiness, this acceptance of what you can and can't study. We always place boundaries on the parameters of our conclusions. That's how you have good science, right? You say, this is my research question, this is what my data says, and this is what I can speak to. And that's what we've learned is a very direct one-to-one in terms of what data you've collected and what you can say. That's a really, I believe that that's a solid foundation. But if you put that within the context of emptiness, I think it is humbling. It makes you realize that even though you felt very confident about how these puzzle pieces fit together, that also exists within a milieu. And so I'll tell you, reading this book, I was trying to think about what I could tell you that it felt like. And the closest I can think of is when I was a junior undergrad and I took my first feminist class and I was like, what? There's a lot, I did a lot of unlearning while reading this book because I've never thought critically about ice. I mean, I don't know, I grew up in Texas. I never thought critically about being cold. I actually, I'd have like running jokes between me, myself, you guys, and everyone online about like, I'm still not used to this weather. I came in sandals. Luckily I had shoes in my office. Like my relationship with the weather and my commentary on ice, other than that, the couple years I lived in Providence, was like small talk about the weather. If you get the right jacket, you can handle the cold, all of that. That, it turns out, is not only a, very limited view of cold, ice, and beyond, but also makes neutral something that's actually very political. And I didn't even know how to start making it political. So I found that each chapter, although Jen starts from the perspective of somebody who's Alaska Native and talking about the context that she knows best, actually ends up theorizing all about ice, far beyond Alaska, taking us into space, taking us across time, through history. And so you too, when you read this book, will start to think critically about ice. And I think you would be embarrassed, except because you're very humble in the ways that you talk about careful guessing. I think that it makes you not put up the defenses as a reader of embarrassment, but instead invites the person to acknowledge that they were uncarefully assuming when actually they could be carefully guessing. And I think that there is something so inviting about not having to know it all that makes you more likely to know more. So let me just see. I could keep going, but since we only have about 15 more minutes, I'm sure y'all have a lot of questions. Maybe we open it up and then we can talk more. Beyond the science and the data of it all, it's just a really beautiful read. Like, I sent it to non-academics, if that tells you anything. Yeah. What do y'all think?
Yeah, Jen. Yeah, introduce yourself because Jen doesn't know everybody in the community.
I'm Jess, and I'm a PhD at and thank you very much for sharing your book with us. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to, you mentioned in your methodology sort of honoring emptiness, and then the framing of ice as empty. And I was wondering like how you see emptiness in those two contexts and how they might be connected, or like maybe they're the same word but mean different things. Yeah, I just would love to hear more about that.
Sure.
We need to repeat.
We want to repeat the question for the folks online. Sorry, we jumped. No, thanks for reminding me. I was told that, but I did not remember to do that. So the question from Jess was about saying a little bit more about emptiness, both in the context of the Arctic framed as empty, but also honoring emptiness in terms of like a research method.
Okay. I also just want to say thank you both. That was so amazing. I'm also trying to like hold back tears, Rowan, because what you said was so, so beautiful. And I just am so appreciative of yeah, just the time and the care that you both took to read the book. I really firmly believe that like one of the things that we actually have power over in the world is our time and energy and what we give to people and share. So it really does mean a lot to me that you both spent so much time with the book. So thank you. So one of the ways that I'm trying to think about emptiness, and this is in the intro too. So like if you only want to read the intro, it's like packed in there. So it's yeah, that's where you can find it. So the ways that the Arctic and I mean Alaska too, like this, I started thinking about this because from the ways that I've grown up, many people think about Alaska as like this big empty last frontier, right? And this is also true of the Arctic more broadly, as like this empty place that's sort of ripe for extraction in many forms, whether that's, you know, like technological advancement, whether it's like literal resource extraction, all of these things sort of like see the Arctic as an empty place where they can take place. And often, you know, the good scholarship that pushes back against that says, well, the Arctic isn't empty, right? It's full of vibrancy, it's full of history, it's full of social relations, which is absolutely 100% true. But for me, I also feel like I'm kind of done doing that as well, right? Like who am I trying to prove? What am I trying to prove into whom and with what sort of tools to show that the Arctic isn't empty? I know that it's not empty. Like the native folks that live there call it home. We know it's not empty. So like, what am I doing trying to like reiterate the same narrative to demonstrate that the Arctic is like ecologically and sociologically vibrant? And so I wanted to try and just leave emptiness then as this kind of capacious generative category that could be rethought. That what if we don't try and disprove emptiness? And what does emptiness actually give us? Not just in sort of a material sense, right? So I look towards ice and snow as like there are empty bubbles, pockets that actually allow for matter to cohere. Like you can't just have solid matter. There is emptiness all around us making up everything. So in that kind of theoretical material sense, we need emptiness to like be beings in the world. But also in a kind of methodological sense, in terms of research, we as researchers do not deserve to know everything about everybody. And in fact, this sort of like compulsion to constantly create information and fill gaps and just produce for me is part of the problem. And so emptiness in that way can also be this capacious generative, again, way to rethink research and rethink the way that we understand material, like matter, materiality, and land and landscape, as like holding emptiness is something that we don't need to combat or use as a tool of, you know, dispossession or towards extraction.
Can I just add something based on what you were saying that I thought was really helped me understand the breadth of ice geographies? Is, you know, Jen was talking about emptiness in like air bubbles, but also beyond that, there was a discussion of thinking about ice, but ice as melted water, or melted ice and water, thinking about ice in the air, and then the relationship between ice, water, and land. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not all just, you know, if you're coming at this just thinking there's ice and non-ice, this book will teach you that actually there are all these gradations, and through this multifaceted lens, do you understand the whole, and the whole that contains emptiness, but also contains all this variation, informs our unlearning. Okay.
Thank you.
I thought that was a really cool part. It helped me understand it because we know about how people theorize land. So it gave me a place to stand so that I could better understand how to theorize ice.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, my name is Marshall. I work at East Science.
Nice to meet you.
This is really moving. Thank you. I also appreciate that you changed the meaning of this thought. And I only been going for a year, but this is not how most of the interrogation. I really appreciate that. A lot of them learn from the people who come for us, especially if they are not familiar now. And it's hard to do. And I feel like my time with my grandparents, but there's an urgency to it, and they're in action, and there's going on for a weekend. And I'm curious how you navigated the generational dynamic, because they also want you to learn things. I don't know if they want you to learn in this book, or any real form of study, but you have a tremendous care of your stewardship that's really evident. And I wonder what that's like to navigate it, because I struggle with it myself. When trying to, if it was up to my grandparents, I still back home something. They really they find it odd that those people are walking like. And I really do know that I'm trying to learn sense to say in your words, but it also such an amazing completely share.
Thank you so much. That's a gorgeous question. You should move back to your.
And repeat the joke.
Do you want to try to?
My quick way to repeat the question is, when you only have a small time at home and you're part of, let's say, I don't know, a diaspora or just a heritage and separated from home, and you can only go home for these short periods of time, and you want to learn from your family, but you have a limited amount of time. How do you learn when teaching is not so direct? It's kind of about just absorbing over time and being in a space. I think what I got from the question is, what happens when your body's one place and your heart's another place, and other people don't have the same priorities that you might have about learning, because they also don't know what you don't know. Yeah.
This is such a gorgeous question, and it's also a really hard one, right? I think for me, in my own experience, I was gonna say you should move home to be with your grandparents. That's my immediate response. Is I would love that for you. But I think that one of the ways that I try to write about it in the book is to, since I have been sort of cognizant of narrative, as a person, as an adult person, or even before that, part of the way that my understanding of my specific indigeneity has all been sort of narrated to me from outsiders, not all of it, but a lot of it, as sort of this kind of declensionist narrative, right? And this sort of decline, loss, urgency, crisis. And that, for me, in my experience, actually is not a helpful way to think about what my responsibilities are and who I'm responsible to and what I'm obligated to do and what my obligations are. And so it's been to use your word, an unlearning of that kind of crisis feeling, to do work on the kind of daily level. There was this one elder who told me, if you learn one word of your language a day, you're learning your language, right? So taking some of that pressure off of yourself to do everything that you feel so stressed to do, that you are, in my estimation, I think that we can be forms of conduits that maybe aren't kind of the normative understandings of what a conduit is supposed to be, or a vessel, learning everything all at once in this urgency kind of way, but in a way that actually makes best sense for you and works in a way that actually is most fulfilling to you in that individual and personal way within the context of your community. But I try in my own practice, which shapes my scholarship, to not lean into the urgency feeling that is sort of pushed on us as peoples. Yeah. Yep.
You could run up here, we could mix it up and you could give it so then Jen doesn't have to.
No, I feel like I can do it this time. Yeah. Hmm.
And I think we'll talk about lack of resources. It's almost like emptiness. With the lack as a mechanism to protect ourselves from colonization. So now we're going to discuss them in times and we'll also say that God don't have resources that people want. Because they want now I'm wondering, from looking experiences, does emptiness as a reference to self and culture identity perception?
Yes. Yeah. Okay, wait, let me repeat that question so I don't forget it. Yeah. Okay, so Aria is wondering if there are forms of emptiness that come up in my own work and my own experience of being at home that are kind of like forms of self-preservation or protection around culture, identity. Good, okay. And sovereignty. Okay, what's your second question? Hmm.
So I was, way, how we use that is not impacting the way they conceptualize it. Or how we conceptualize it, right?
The second question is about communities that live on and with ice. As ice changes, how are they understanding that change? Is there more that I'm missing? And how that might also understand my thinking of it. So the first question about emptiness, these are also really great questions. Thank you so much. I'm trying to hold all of them before it slips through my brain. The first question about emptiness is absolutely. I think that it's really interesting. I would love to think with you more about the Nepal situation and how like the lack of resources is actually a form of like anti-coloniality in a way. In the way that I was thinking about one of the ways I was thinking about emptiness in terms of research is that communities will often like withhold information at this point, you know, because so much violent extraction has occurred over time that it's like well within our rights to be like, actually, I don't want to tell you about this. I'm not interested in this becoming data. I don't care about how this shows up in your paper, et cetera. And that has been theorized in Native studies as a kind of refusal to cite Audra Simpson. She's one of Audra Simpson, Glenn Coulthard, Leanne Simpson. These scholars have thought about refusal as a tactic to protect and preserve Indigenous communities and their knowledges. And I feel like emptiness for me is also a form of that, right? Like intentionally making gaps in the research so that knowledge belongs to communities and not to the academy in some way. The second question, also a good one, you know, part of what I say in the book is that there are so many, you know, Indigenous leaders, activists, intellectuals who are talking about this in the sort of like climate justice ways. And that work is incredible and important and needed. And in that sense, like I'm not critical of however and whatever kinds of language they feel is most important or narrative devices to talk about their homelands changing in whatever ways, like that's not my business, right? If they feel like crisis or urgency is actually most strategically useful to talk about in that way to get political movement, then like, great. Like that's not what I'm not trying to offer that as critical of those moves. So there's like, yeah, there's just a ton of work being done by, you know, activists sort of like on the ground, right? And this is sort of an offering to think to add to that in more of a conceptual kind of terrain.
We
Yeah.
only have 1 minute left, so I think, Courtney, go ahead with your question. and then-
Hmm. Right.
Maybe think about that critique and like, have you thought about this and like, why does it feel like on those days?
Mm. 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 Yeah, that's a really rich question too. You all are so smart. Thank you so much for these beautiful questions. Yeah, great.
In short, the question was, in studying emptiness, how do you know the difference between exclusion versus refusal?
Thank you, Roland. So happy to have this support too.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so I think that, right, like each sort of context has its own set of needs and things to be attentive to. I think for me, a lot, my PhD is in ethnic studies, and so a lot of my training was about this idea of the untold stories. Like we need to be voices that have been silenced before, and I feel like which is absolutely important, integral, great. And then it gets to a certain moment where I'm wondering about like the liberal politics of recognition and identity, as opposed to like, is it just additive, right? Is it add and stir? Is that what's happening in these moments where we feel compelled to like add stories that have not yet been told? So that for me would be the question, right? Like what am I trying to do with these moments of emptiness or these moments of silence, or we see that some of the story hasn't been told. It's like so context specific, but I keep that in my mind because I don't know that the add and stir method is doing exactly like the critical work and getting us to a different place that maybe we have intended in some earlier moments. Yeah.
I mean, we're now 2 minutes over, but I'll just say that by the time I got to the end of the book, one of my takeaways was all these people that think they're not dealing, as in most of us, that think they're not dealing with emptiness have actually just accepted essentially colonial fixed borders and produced within that context. And so, if you're rejecting emptiness, it's not like just like a cool thing that you're doing as a new pivot to see to see the world in a different way. It actually turns out that the boundaries that were placed on the studies that are done, because they've neglected the context, because they've neglected some forms of emptiness, produced, what is it? Like precise, but not, what's the science terms when they have two different words? It means they all got the bullseye, but it was off on the wrong mark. What is it?
Accuracy.
Yeah, accuracy versus precision. That's what I got by the end. Thank you. And with that, let's all thank Professor General Smith. I'm going to run to a faculty meeting. I think